all about the new relationship between Washington and Cuba, with concessions on travel restrictions, offers of negotiations, and talks of new beginnings. The half-century chill in the U.S.-Cuba affairs looks like it might be warming up. To talk about what all this means, we're joined now by Pablo. He's chair in Latin American politics at the University of Calgary. So, Pablo, let's just talk about how the summit started. Barack Obama giving the speech using words like new beginning, fresh start. Let's get behind the words, though. What does it really signify?
This is a summit of huge significance, and I think President Obama's overtures toward Cuba in particular are very, very important. The fact that Cuba is not officially on the program at the summit, but it has become the topic of discussion is very, very important insofar as it signals a break from U.S. policies toward Cuba in the past. Secretary of State Clinton has suggested that those policies have failed. This is very strong language. So it represents possibly putting to an end, finally, one of the last remaining conflicts of the Cold War.
It takes two, of course. So how open do you think Cuba is to strengthening ties with the United States?
Cuba has signaled that it is open. The language coming from Raul Castro certainly indicates that. And Cuba, of course, has a lot to gain from a more normal kind of relationship with the United States, economically, for the future of development in the country. And insofar as Cuba may be able to gain some kind of guarantee that the United States will respect its sovereignty, I think Cuba has a lot to gain from this. On the other hand, Cuba has something to lose as well, because the threat of American bullying toward the island has been a very convenient scapegoat for Cuba's leaders in the past to strengthen, to maintain their own largely autocratic rule. So it's a mixed bag.
Let's talk a little bit about Venezuela, because although Cuba took center stage right off the bat, Venezuelan President Hugo Chavez saying today he was certain that relations with the U.S. would improve now that Barack Obama is in the White House in terms of his country. What does that development tell you?
I think what's interesting here is that President Obama is doing with Latin America what he has signaled he wants to do elsewhere in the world. In other words, talk to enemies in countries that may potentially be enemies. And so he's done this in other parts of the world. And so now he's extending, he's rebuilding the kinds of diplomatic relations with Latin America that the previous administration had certainly allowed to deteriorate. So this is very important. I should mention also that one of the interesting things to note here is what's not been talked about at the summit. There's been a lot of talk about Cuba, about rebuilding diplomatic relations, and some of the official items on the agenda involve climate change, economic development, security. What's not mentioned is democracy. Traditionally, the issue of democracy has been very important whenever leaders of the Organization of American States countries meet. The OAS is, of course, committed to the defense and the promotion of democracy in the Americas. And so here there may be an issue insofar as stronger ties with Cuba and certainly better ties with Venezuela may mean that the question of democracy may have to be tempered somewhat or possibly put on the back burner, or perhaps that a new way will have to be found to put pressure on Cuba in particular to become more democratic. So that remains an open question.
Let's talk about Canada. You know, Canadian Prime Minister Stephen Harper said that he didn't want Cuba to be the focus. Free trade should be. Canada's had good relations, fairly good relations with Cuba over the years. What do you think the smoothing over of U.S. relations with Cuba is going to mean here at home?
I think this is one of the first times in recent memory where the U.S. has outmaneuvered Canada in the Americas. And under the previous Bush administration, American diplomacy in the Americas was frankly very, very poor. And Canada had a lot of room to build strengthened ties with Latin American partners. And Canada did a lot of good things during those years. Now we find ourselves in a very different situation where President Obama is hugely popular in Latin America, and Prime Minister Harper struggles to get any kind of attention. President Obama has been striking, making diplomatic declarations with a number of different Latin American leaders, strengthening those ties in a way that we just don't see happening with Canada.
Thanks so much, Pablo, for your perspective on this. There's going to be a lot more to talk about in the coming weeks and months, no doubt. That is Pablo Pulitzer from the University of Calgary. Well, still to come, Natasha Ramsahai is back, and she's got your national weather forecast with her just ahead on CBC News Today.